Well, there isn't really all that much need for this session, since it's all basically been said in this remarkably brilliant and extraordinarily cheap book, which is on sale just behind you. But before you rush for that, just for the sake of appearances, you know, we'll say. Actually, one of the most interesting things about this book is full of magnificent things, but one of the most interesting things about it, and please don't let this go outside these 4 walls, right? And it would the special branch man not report this back, you know, to his headquarters, is that for a surreally short period of time, it was something like number 7 or 8 on Amazon's list of best-selling business books. Talk about a backhanded compliment. And why, you know, when capitalists have to read me, they're getting really desperate. I don't think that bankers have quite got round to reading my work on hermeneutical phenomenology yet, but no doubt they're considering it. Why is that the case? I mean, I ask myself, you know, what does Marx mean to capitalists? And I suppose the answer is basically, he means capitalism. Not so much Marxism, not so much socialism, but giving a name to the system that they run, or that runs them, you might say. Yes. And of course, that's actually a very bad thing for capitalists. You know, capitalists shouldn't talk about capitalism. And one sign of the current crisis is that they are doing it. The media are full of the word capitalism. It wasn't happening, you know, 10 years ago. It's all right for capitalists to talk about, you know, a free society, or Western democracy, or even free enterprise. But to use the word capitalism is, of course, to define, to identify, to distance, to objectivate a certain coherent system. A contradictory system, to be sure, but relatively coherent. And that they shouldn't do. You know, that's dangerous because, of course, a system has limits by virtue of being a system, and therefore has alternatives, has other possibilities. A system has origins, and what was born can always die. Yes. So it's much better not to talk in that way. It's much better to allow the system, so-called, to be just part of the invisible colour of daily life itself. What stops them from doing that and sends them rushing in hordes to buy this book is, of course, the fact of crisis. What happens with crisis is that the system becomes perceptible as a system. And that in itself is bad news for those who invest in it. And that's part of what I think we've been seeing in our time, and in a curious sense, what crisis then does, making the system newly perceptible and so can be interrogated in new ways, is actually what Marx did, curiously enough. Capitalism is a bit like a sort of bad soap opera, in the sense that most of the time it's full of very kind of routine and dreary repetitions, nothing much happens, and then suddenly there's a kind of grotesque melodrama, there's a kind of outbreak of crisis. Yes, capitalism is either too routine, too normal, in a sense, or too abnormal, too aberrant. You know, it gives you a choice between sort of inertia on the one hand and anxiety on the other, and that in itself is not good for people. That's not good. But Marx did really what capitalist crisis does. One of his great achievements, surely, and one reason why he's now back on the agenda along with the fact of crisis, is that he actually named, identified, delimited a particular relative historical form of life called capitalism that was by no means eternal, that was by no means perpetual. And that, in a sense, I think, was one of Marx's most signal achievements, one of the ways in which he was right. There were many other ways in which Marx wasn't original. I mean, Samuel Johnson, once reviewing the book, said famously that there were many true and new things in this book. The only problem, he said, was what was true was what not new, and what was new was not true. Well, I wouldn't at all go as far as to say that about Marx. But there's plenty in Marx, for example, the idea of historical modes of production that was already known to the Enlightenment, the idea of class. Marx and Engels said they themselves had not by any means originated this notion, not even the idea of class struggle, certainly not the idea, say, of alienation. Communism is a very ancient idea. Revolution is has a long history. So it wasn't so much those particular individual doctrines, it was the very power to distantiate the system and allow us to see it as something that was relatively ephemeral and which could therefore be broken with in certain kinds of circumstances. It might be thought that trying to put in a good word for Marx, is a bit, for some people, a bit like trying to put in a good word for Jack the Ripper. Actually, it occurred to me when I wrote that sentence that Marx might have been Jack the Ripper. It's about the only hypothesis that hasn't been considered. Maybe he slunk out of the back door of the British Museum, to go down to the East End from time to time. Incidentally, the reason, of course, why Marx was labouring away so hard at economics in the British Museum was not, as his critics and opponents said, because he was obsessed by the economic and saw it everywhere, as Freud is supposed to see sexuality everywhere, but in order to diminish the tyranny of the economic over the lives of men and women. That was why he engaged with it. He talked about wanting to be shut, he said, of all this economic crap, or whatever the German was, I'm not sure, in order to write a book about a French novelist, about Balzac. Indeed, one of the great mistakes about Marx, which I totally dispel, flick to the boundary with superb aplomb in this book, is the whole idea that his work is about labour. Not at all. His work is about leisure. His work is about the scandal that in the society with the most developed productive forces in history, we still have to work probably harder than our Neolithic ancestors. Marx finds the solution to that, of course, in the way that we go about organising our production. Marx is about freeing us from the tyranny of labour. The only good reason for being a Marxist is you don't like to do any work. This is a position that should appeal to any layabouts in the audience. I'm sure there are not very many, but if you want simply to hang around all day wearing loose crimson garments, sipping absinthe and reading Homer to each other, and that's only the working time, then Marx is the man. This is the right politics for you. Okay. I'll just touch very, very quickly on a couple of points. It is remarkable, isn't it, how much history has happened in the past decade. Yes, in the decade when people here, for example, were coming to, no doubt, political consciousness, political action, around 2000, on the brink of the new millennium, history seemed to be frozen and arrested in a perpetual kind of image. Yes, there was talk of the end of history. There was talk of the end of grand narratives. All that you would have now would be a sort of modest, piecemeal, pragmatic, post-historical, post-metaphysical, post-ideological system. Yes? And then hardly were those words out of the mouths of the leading ideologues of the West than they went dramatically into reverse. First of all, there was the World Trade Center. There was the birth of a new grand narrative, that of the stirring of radical Islam, the anger of parts of the world that have been ridden over, roughshod by the West in its triumphalistic post-Cold War phase. That got off the ground, and there was then a kind of interleaving of a number of grand narratives, because of course no sooner had that shock been absorbed than the crisis of capitalism broke out in a way not at all unrelated to the wars that were now being fought against so-called terror. Yes, so that those two grand narratives were interlocked. We were then to see the crisis sort of simmer and then in our own day break out virulently again, but also to see the so-called Arab Spring, the emergence of a whole set of quasi-spontaneous new forms of popular protest and opposition, suddenly we were in an entirely different world, where, for example, symptomatically, the word postmodernism is no longer really in fashion. Yes? And we're confronted with a full-bloodedly metaphysical enemy in radical Islam. The West really can't afford any longer the kind of rather laid-back, triumphalistic, end of ideologies pragmatism, which was, it was riding high with only about a decade ago. The fact that one grand narrative was announced to be ended, that of the war against communism, so-called, and then another began, those two factors, of course, interlocked. It was the West's triumph at the end of the Cold War, which allowed it that to roll over various forces that opposed it, and which was one of the conditions that bred the backlash of radical Islam. So that, as it were, the very closing down of one grand narrative actually managed to spring open another. That's not the first time that's happened. History has been full of that kind of irony. Hegel thought with becoming modesty that history had now culminated inside his own head. Not everybody believes that, but Hegel thought that. And yet, that itself managed to set in train a whole series of reactions to that proposition which kept history going. The great avant-gardes of the 20th century, the great revolutionary avant-gardes, thought they could wipe history clean, and create a space in which they could purely create, yes, without the detriment, the obstacle of an existing history. And yet to do that, of course, is itself an historical event. It adds to the very history that you're trying to clean. So there's something curiously self-defeating about the end of grand narratives, and that's been obvious with a vengeance, I think, in our own time. Let me just conclude by saying that among all of one of the original points about Marx, of course, is his enormous praise for the middle classes. You know a Marxist, by somebody who goes around praising the middle class all the time. Yes, that Marx saw what an enormous revolutionary force the middle class had been, and saw that any socialism which failed to base itself upon that, was going to be crippled and bankrupt from the outset. So, one good reason for being a Marxist, apart from the fact you don't like to work, and apart from just annoying people that you don't like, is actually, Marx's view of history is much more judicious, call it dialectical, if you like, than those who simply say in a kind of callow way, let's get rid of all that middle class history, that class history, and start again. And finally, just a quick note about Marx as utopian. I have a section on that in this book, just trying to show how for Marx, and Marx is famously a non-utopian thinker, in that he doesn't present us with images of the future, which can always become idols and fetishes. Instead, for Marx, the only image of the future that matters is the failure of the present, is a negative image of what is still to be repaired, what is still to be done. Walter Benjamin famously remarked that men and women are stirred to revolt not by dreams of liberated grandchildren, by utopian images of the future, but by memories of enslaved ancestors. Marx was a prophet in just this sense, not because he peered into a crystal ball. The Old Testament prophets didn't do that. The Old Testament prophet was the figure who said, look, unless you change your ways, unless you achieve justice, there won't be a future, or at least it will be highly unpleasant.
Okay, well, how to follow Terry Eagleton on Marx? Very hard. One thing I want to say is that you should definitely read Terry's book. In fact, I think, didn't I endorse it? I think there's something, yeah. No, it's not there. It's disappeared. Anyway, I did. I wasn't grand enough to make the back cover. But I think it's a fantastic book, and it's very much worth reading. I'd also encourage you to read Marx himself. Just go through the interpreter, the sole guide to the thought of Marx. But because I think that because of the things that Terry has been talking about, and in particular because of the economic crisis, even quite abstract things that Marx writes have gained or regained an actuality that is quite astonishing. And one example of that is that one of Marx's more abstruse doctrines is the theory of commodity fetishism, which is the idea that when you live in an economic system like capitalism, which is governed by the market, what are historically specific and transitory social relations take on the shape, the appearance of something natural. One of the best examples I've always thought of this is that when you watch the news, you'll get the share prices and the weather side by side. So it's like there's one set of natural phenomena which is the weather, outside human control. We're just told whether it's going to rain tomorrow and so on. And then there's this other natural phenomenon, which is the fluctuations of the financial markets, and which is also governed by physical laws outside people's control. And you're hearing about that as well. Well, actually, we know these days that the weather is influenced by human action. There are huge protests going on in Durban at the minute because of the UN climate change conference, and I'm sure it won't come to a surprise to you that in fact what happens in the economy is governed by human actions and quite specific kinds of human organisation. Now that probably sounds fairly abstract, but it's very relevant to what's happening at the present time. I got completely sick of how, if you listen to any or watch any discussion about any kind of public policy on television or listen to it on the radio or whatever, you'll hear again and again from the discussants and the journalists and so on and so forth that times are hard, we're poorer than we used to be, there's less to go round, and therefore we have to accept that we're not going to be able to do all sorts of things that we thought we were able to do. This is a very good example of commodity fetishism, because the fact that it's not just that the fact there's an economic crisis is because of the kind of inherent instabilities that Marx explains, that Marx unravels in his great work, Capital, but also that the fact that the economy is declining, not just in this country but globally, is because of political choices that have been made by the dominant forces in our societies. When George Osborne says, as he did this week, times are hard, we're going to have even longer austerity and so on, that's not because it's been forced on him by some kind of law of nature. It's because the constellation of class forces that he represents want a solution to the crisis that is going to maintain the wealth and the profits and the privileges of what I'd call the neoliberal coalition, the very narrow group of forces, the 1%, who have done well out of neoliberalism. Osborne is determined to protect the wealth and the privileges and power of that group. So he's opted for a solution that involves austerity, and because it involves austerity, involves a shrinking economy. So what is a political choice is dressed up as something natural. And what is, in essence, an assertion of class power is presented as a realistic response to a very difficult economic situation. But what we've seen this year is a real turn. When Terry said there's been a lot of history in the last decade, my God, there's been a lot of history in the past year. I mean, let's just think of what's happened in the past year. First of all, we've had the developing revolutionary wave in the Arab world, and in particular the incredible experiences that are continuing to take place in Egypt. It's not just that people occupied Tahrir and other urban centres in Egypt at the beginning of the year and forced out Mubarak, but in the past few weeks we've seen 1 million people again occupying Tahrir Square, fighting off through desperate physical struggle the forces of the Egyptian state that was trying to crush them, maintaining their position, not as yet succeeding in overthrowing the military junta, the SCAF that now runs Egypt, but nevertheless maintaining their position and asserting an insistence that the revolutionary process isn't over in Egypt, but in many ways it's just begun. And while the ostensible issues, the focus issues that have mobilised people back in January and mobilise people now, are political ones to do with getting rid of Mubarak and now getting rid of Field Marshal Tantawi and the rest of the military junta and so on and so forth. There is stubbornly concealed within these political phenomena an economic content to do with the way in which neoliberalism has polarised and impoverished Egyptian society that surfaces from time to time. That surfaced, for example, in the enormous strike wave that swept through Egypt in August and September this year. So we have a real revolutionary process, and all the postmodernists, I mean, I agree with Terry, postmodernism is finished. You can tell that because now there's an exhibition about postmodernism in the Victoria and Albert. That's where postmodernism belongs, with the doilies. But one measure of the failure of the death of postmodernism is that something that I think postmodernism was about repressing, which was revolution, is not just back on the agenda, but is a visible reality, is changing our world before our own eyes. So that's one very important development. Secondly, the emergence of the Occupy movement. I mean, I think this is an astonishing development. I mean, it's not just that it's, you know, thrown upside down the hierarchy of the Church of England, which is clearly a very fragile and polarised structure at the best of times. They're a bit, I mean, the Church of England seem really like a bunch of Trotskyist groups, really, at each other's throats. But it's more important than that, is when you see the way in which Occupy has changed the debate in the United States. That up to September, the political debate about the crisis was dominated by the right-wing nutcases of the Tea Party movement, who somehow think that the state, well, I mean, I suppose in a sense, they say things that Marxists should agree with. They want to abolish the state, but they want to abolish the state to allow capitalism to flourish. Well, that's not quite the Marxist plan. But but Occupy changed the nature of the debate. The slogan, I mean, even if all the occupies, the actual occupations disappear, the slogan that they came up with of 99% versus the 1% was a real work of political genius. Because, you know, one of the things that you read about in Terry's book is the nature of Marx's understanding of class society and what Marx means when he talks about capitalism as a society that's structured by the antagonism between capital and wage labour. But this is a point of view that people like Terry and me and lots of others have had to fight for against a dominant consensus that says, you know, Marx was right with respect to the 19th century, but society is much more complex. There aren't clear class divisions anymore. All people want to do is to shop and things like that. And the 1% versus the 9% just cuts through all that. Cuts through all that by essentially finding a way of presenting. I don't think this was the plan of the people who formulated, but effectively it presents the Marxist notion of capitalism as a society structured by the antagonism between exploiters and exploited quite brilliantly. And that's an enormously important development. But the third way in which history has kind of woken up this year, the third way is of course with the strikes, the public sector strikes. First on the 30th of June and then this week. Because again, that's something that was supposed to be dead and gone. It wasn't just that history had gone and revolution had gone, but actually belonging appropriately in the same cluster, the working class was supposed to have gone. The working class was supposed to have been destroyed, atomised, integrated in the system, etc., etc., etc. But what we've seen is here in Britain, where the working class movement has suffered a very long hangover from the defeats under Thatcher back in the 1980s, we have seen the beginnings of the recovery of working class organisation and working class militancy. And the idiotic media commentators who say, who echo Cameron and say that the 30th was a damp squib and that the only significant thing that happened was that Jeremy Clarkson behaved like a reactionary swine on the one show and things like that, just don't understand the significance of what's happening. When you see the scale of the demonstrations, not so much in London, the London demonstration is good, but the fact, relatively small towns all over Britain, there were thousands of people demonstrating on a scale that activists who live in those cities and who can remember struggles going back many years simply say is totally unprecedented. That's the British working class movement coming back to life. What we're seeing is the rebirth of the power of the organised working class in Britain, and there are some, not everywhere, but there are parallel developments in some other countries as well. And that's enormously important because I think Occupy is great, but I think its impact has primarily been at the symbolic level, at the level of images and concepts and debating points and how you frame arguments. And all that's really important. But unless this symbolic challenge to capitalism is tied to collective social power, then it will dissipate itself in the way in which the movement that came out of the Seattle protests did. What we're seeing from the top is an assertion of class power, and the only way that kind of assertion can be met is with another assertion of class power, and we begin to see the possibility of that happening. I just want to make one final point before I conclude, which is not about history, but is about the future. Because the question is that there could come out of this situation a much happier picture than we've experienced, certainly anyone of any age have experienced in recent decades, in which we do see a rebirth of a real revolutionary movement that can begin to make history again. But there's absolutely nothing inevitable about it. If we look at Egypt, there's a desperate struggle to create some kind of coherent revolutionary force that can offer a way forward in that country, an alternative to the generals and the Islamists and the pro-capitalist liberals and so on and so forth. But it's very tough and very difficult and very uncertain. In this context, I want to assert the necessity of revolutionary socialist organisation. Terry's written some great books, lots of great books. One of them, I'm sure you remember this, Terry, is the novel Saints and Scholars, which is a brilliant exercise in alternative history in which James Connolly and Ludwig Wittgenstein meet each other, I think in the west of Ireland, isn't it? And discuss revolution and history and all sorts of things. It's fantastic. But it also includes a very funny caricature of the Socialist Workers' Party in an earlier phase in our existence, I think transmogrified into a far-left Russian group that is always talking about how many people joined it this week. Now, maybe we got a bit carried away then. Terry's talking about the 1970s. But the kind of obsession that we do in the SWP have with people joining us and becoming members and so on and so forth is something that I would defend. Because if we want to move beyond the realm of the abstract possibilities that are created by this new historical change, historical situation, then the forces of self-conscious revolutionaries, the people who really do want to change the world and have a sense of how things are opening up, do need to band together and organise together and increase their numbers and increase their social weight to contribute to this evolving political constellation is developing. So I would say this is a tremendous historical moment. Capitalism is in crisis. Capitalism is also being challenged for the first time in a long time. But in order to realise the possibilities that are emerging, we do need revolutionary socialist organisation, and we need people to join it.
Thank you, Alex. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, Nina Power. Right.
Sorry, I've got my coat on, it's really cold. Okay, I'm not really going to talk so much about Marx. Obviously, he was right, he is right, he will continue to be right. So what I'm going to do is just sort of list some kind of challenges that I think have emerged over the past sort of year and will be with us for the next year, and particularly in relation to thinking about youth and students. But I want to agree first of all with something that Terry Eagleton said about capitalism, like the importance of capitalism being openly discussed as a word. I think it's right. It was hidden for a very long time in a strange way. It was never kind of directly addressed. And there's an amazing cover of The Economist from October 2008, which had like a sort of Latinate sort of a carving of a lion, like in pain, and the cover said "Capitalism at Bay," and I just thought, wow, it's amazing. You know, they're actually sort of admitting it, and you know, it's a kind of beautiful image with this very right-wing prose of this wounded lion, and I think that's quite a sort of nice image in a way of the wounded lion. And I think one of the interesting things about, you know, when capitalism starts to talk about itself, or when people start to talk about capitalism, not as a thing but as a set of relations, then what we need to do in a way is to get people also talking about communism. And it's interesting about this sort of burgeoning sort of dimensions of thinking about class. I mean, I agree about the 99%, we're the 99% slogan. You know, how do we kind of draw on that to make it more a discussion about class in a kind of active way. And so thinking about class, and I have had a discussion, well, a debate with Alex before about using, thinking about generations, and I agree that it's not a very useful way of thinking about politics to make divisions between generations, baby boomers and jilted generation and so on. I mean, I think it's a temptation, and not a very politically helpful one. I think the political struggle's obviously, you know, got to be across ages. Nevertheless, I think, you know, one thing we have to think about is what's happening to young people. I mean, both in terms of their futures, in terms of fees, in terms of what's happening to them in terms of criminal arrests, in terms of protests, crackdown on protests on campus, and so on. And try and work out, and I don't have a great solution to this, but try to work out how that kind of plays into broader questions of class struggle. What happens when you get a generation of people who don't know for certain that they're going to be in employment. I mean, we have a government that really is not doing anything to sort that out at all. There's kind of no alternative. You know, you get rid of kind of apprenticeships. You massively increase fees. I mean, the fee rise, as I'm sure you know, is the single biggest fee rise at any time in history at any country in the world ever. Right? So that moved from £3,000 to £9,000, the single biggest fee increase. Obviously, we've got the rest of this academic year before it kind of really kicks in, and I think, you know, what we're seeing on the part of management and on the part of the police and the sort of rushing through of even the squatting law, which may have implications for occupations on campuses and so on, is a kind of desperate attempt to stop protests on campus, particularly, I mean, the last year lots of places got all of these electronic swipe things. Places had them before, but now they're kind of activating them as patterns. So my university at Roehampton, for example, even you know, normal members of staff, academic teaching staff, their swipe card won't open the management corridor, right? Because they're that terrified, you know, that even the staff will sort of, you know, join in and help the students, which is true. We've often discussed leaving our cards around for students to find. Anyway. But I think, you know, so we're seeing this kind of criminalisation of young people, and you know, everything from kids on street corners to criminalisation of students. We get police coming into campuses, talking to staff and management about domestic extremists and how we're supposed to spy not only on our radicalised Muslim students, whoever they are, but also on any form of student radicals. So if everyone became one, then we wouldn't, you know, it would be great. But I think one of the interesting things that's happened, one of the important things that happened, just thinking about, you know, in relation to universities, is the way in which staff and students have really come to recognise a shared concern, I mean, against management and against the government and against these kind of policies. And so, like on picket lines, you know, we get far more students come out and sort of stand with us than we had done for previous kind of UCU and other picket lines. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear where the lines are drawn. So on the big student protests of last year, the first one, 50,000, however many people marched, students were marching with their lecturers. And one of the things that I think needs to happen is more lecturers need to defend their students, because it's students who are getting picked up and sentenced. Obviously, I'm doing a lot of work with Defend the Right to Protest campaign, people like Hannah and Sean as well, doing great work. But what we're seeing is devastating. I mean, you sit in court and you watch people go down for 18 months for kicking a fence. It's shocking. And I think, obviously all of these sentences are just deterrent sentences. They're sort of put in place so that other people will think twice about going on a protest even. So we're going back to this kind of situation. Obviously in the 80s, Thatcher knew that she'd have to call on the police, so she upped their wages and improved their conditions because she knew in a couple of years' time she'd need them to break the miners, and that's what happened. Now we've got a slightly weirder situation, which the police are also experiencing cuts, but are not yet really protesting about it. I mean, they're not allowed to go on strike, and I wouldn't personally support them if they did, but I mean in principle I would, but personally not. But anyway, so we've got maybe this potentially quite volatile situation with the police. Well, it is already volatile, it may just beat the shit out of people, as we know. But we've got this kind of, also with the judiciary, that yesterday, I don't know if people saw the report, there's a so-called case-hardened senior prosecutor in the riots cases, who admitted that she's been reduced to tears by the severity of the sentencing. She said of one sentence, which is 18 months for somebody, a young man, 17 years old, for a minor offence, she said, was that justice? Because as a prosecutor, I don't think it was. That boy's life has been ruined. And it seems very obvious that this is kind of, the ruining of young lives is something that this government, enjoys doing. They don't seem to care about people's future at all. And I think one thing we've got to try and work out theoretically perhaps is what do we do with debt in relation to thinking about class. One of the most interesting movements I think at the moment in America is about the refusal to pay back student debt. Because obviously if you get a mass mobilisation around the refusal of paying back debt, there's not a lot they can do. I mean, if everybody said, I'm not going to pay my student debt back, I'm never going to pay it back, then they're in an interesting situation. And I always like that final scene of Fight Club where they blow up the credit card offices and everyone's debt is destroyed. Obviously now no one gets a credit card because the banks have become terrified, but I think if we could do something similar for the student loan companies and the banks.
I'm down for that.
So whilst I don't want this to be a kind of a discussion about generations, although I think we've got to work out a way of talking about class and talking about employment in relation to heavy youth unemployment and perhaps a prolonged period of massive youth unemployment without any other alternatives, without apprenticeships, without work, people whose sort of lives and futures are being ruined either through criminalisation, but simply there not being anything there. And I think there's a real massive potential anger and force for mobilisation. For the strike the other day, the group of people that had most supported the strike were 18 to 24-year-olds. Like massive majority support for the strike, and that's really, really interesting. This is a strike, nominally about pensions, but obviously about everything else. And it's young people who supported the strike the most. And I think we've got to work out a way of tying our discussions about work and employment with those of unemployment and debt and the student struggle. And I'll stop there.
I thoroughly endorse the point about Marx for our time. That Marx is only just arrived. Somebody wrote to me from Australia, I think from the outback, and said, why didn't you call the book Marx is Right? And I wrote back and said, actually, he's dead. Probably this guy lived in some very remote part of Australia where the news takes a long time to through. But yes, I mean, there's a sense in which Marx has always been arriving and receding, isn't there? A Marx for different times, but there is a sense in which a new Marx has newly arrived, and I think that Dan was quite right that there is a close relation between that kind of reflection that kind of intellectual reflection and history actually moving beneath one's feet. I mean, we've been through a long period where we were all beating our breasts and saying the problem was that theory was overshooting the possibilities of practice, and that sometimes happens, of course. But now, in a sense, we're in a situation where theory once again has to hobble pretty hard to catch up with the history, as it did in the, say, lead up to the Bolshevik Revolution, catch up with the history that's moving. When you don't have that kind of crisis, it's often possible for Marxism, as the comrade at the back was saying, to be, as it were, more cultural, when there's not an immediate political or economic urgency, there are certain intellectual gains, because then you can sort of begin to think round the situation. You have the time and the leisure to do that. But, crisis concentrates the mind wonderfully, as it were. And then the important intellectuals become people like David Harvey and others who are, in the deepest and widest way, addressing absolutely bread and butter issues. We cultural types are fairly useless, we occasionally can say interesting things about television or George Eliot or something, but don't look to us,
Okay, well, I think I'm going to give the speakers about 2 minutes each to sort of come back on those points. So, Nina, if you'd like to go first, and we do a reverse order thing.
Just briefly, on the first and the last question, really, I think this thing about aspiration is maybe a bit better way of putting this question. When I said we shouldn't talk in terms of generation, then I did accidentally introduce that problem, but whilst trying to negate it. It was dialectical, but not. I think, another report out yesterday said that, now most adults, let's say, most people with kids think that their kids will have a worse life than they will. I think this is a generally, increasingly well-recognised fact. I remember my mum realising it, and she was quite shocked. And I think, at the same time, there are positive things about this. I think in the 90s, I grew up in the 90s, it was horrible. It was filled with irony, and people were sort of against politics because it wasn't cool and stuff. It was awful. It's so boring. Anyway, but I think that there's a whole generation of people who didn't have to go through that, and Britpop and everything. But anyway, there's all these young people who didn't have to live through that, and don't have the same sort of knee-jerk reaction to thinking about politics, or being politically engaged, or being active. And I think this is hugely, hugely significant. And just to reiterate the final point, what we need is clear theoretical explanations for why things work the way they work. What money is, even. The kinds of abstractions that are real, that dominate our life. And, we need more people, academics and activists, to be explaining these things, not in a patronising way, but in a clear way, in a way that makes sense. That people already know and people already understand that that's how the world works, but don't quite have the tools to think about it. Things about how the police work, how the state works, how the Crown Prosecution Service works. All of these things, we've got to keep, giving the best explanation for this. One of the dangers, I think, about things like Occupy and other things, for all their brilliance, is sometimes, cranky ideas can take hold of people, and if we don't have good alternative explanations, then we end up in sort of, potentially dubious kind of theories about the world, and that's not good.
Just 2 points. First of all, listening to Nina when she was talking about the different ways in which the coalition is targeting young people, it struck me that there's a particularly obnoxious contradiction about our society, which is the images that saturate our society, more often than not, images of young people, the sort of reference points of beauty and so on, are typically to do with youth and so on. So, on the one hand, there's this enormous, at the level of image and spectacle and so on, there's this enormous emphasis on the young, but then in all sorts of ways, some of which Nina has talked about, the young get shafted. And I would, as Nina's pointed out, I'm much too old to understand this.
I didn't.
No, it's all right. But if I were young, I think that would piss me off quite a lot. It could turn into a motive for revolution. among many. The other point I wanted to make was this, which is that one way in which Marx is, I think it's true that in certain ways Marx is more actual now than he was, it's some arbitrary time in the past. One reason for that is that the kind of capitalism that we live under now is more like capitalism in Marx's era than it was, say, in the mid-20th century, when you had highly statised forms of capitalism, developed welfare states, certainly in this part of the world, fairly stable employment. What in a way we've got now is a kind of globalised and much more developed version of the free market capitalism that Marx is analysing in Capital. And this is relevant to the question of precarity, because one of the most interesting bits of Capital Volume 1 is where Marx analyses what he calls the reserve army of labour, by which he means unemployment and the kind of structural role it plays in sustaining capitalist exploitation. But he looks at the different kind of layers of the working class, particularly in Britain at the time, and the way in which some are more or less integrated in the labour market, some have more or less stable employment, and effectively he portrays in some industries what then would have been called casualisation, but we now call precarity. And I think it's a very useful analysis, because it both demonstrates the particular ways in which people are both integrated in and oppressed by capitalism, but he also integrates the interconnections between the different kinds of workers. And I think that's an insight that's important to hold on to at the present time. I mean, there's some people who say what we should be doing now is essentially organising the precarious and so on and so forth. This seems to be a misunderstanding of the possibilities, because when you have the scale of working class action that we saw on Wednesday, as I said, often in very quite small places, and you have in the sort of core public sector workforce a revival of confidence and militancy and self-organisation, that's going to radiate out because of all the connections between what were probably, on the whole, relatively stable kinds of workers in relatively, well, I should correct myself, what was fairly safe forms of employment, although a lot of it is disappearing into thin air. There are lots of connections between those workers and those who are in more precarious positions, and some of the more secure workers are becoming precarious. I mean, 2 years ago, I, along with 250 other academics at King's College, were told that our jobs were at risk of redundancy and we should reapply for our jobs. And it was amazing to see the amazement from all these well-established professors that they were as vulnerable to the brutality of capitalism as someone working for McDonald's. So it seems to me, as working class struggle revives, there are going to be ways in which we can build a working class movement that unites the different sections of the class and that cuts through the divisions between young and old, more stable, less stable, better paid, and so on. And that's another reason why this moment is so historic.
Just a final word on the generational point. I actually knew Alex when he was about 22, and I can assure him but he hasn't changed at all. He was behaved just as old then as he does now. I'll just finish. This is not really what all this meeting is about, but I'll just finish just to follow up the point that was emerging towards the end about the turning away from a Marxism that was primarily about culture and philosophy to a Marxism about political and economic struggle. The first kind has traditionally been known as Western Marxism, and it may be that in a certain seismic moment we're seeing the final ends of that particular tradition, much of which was a kind of reaction to a Stalinized or frozen sort of socialism, where there didn't seem to be that political impetus, and therefore there was a kind of displacement to issues of culture and so on. We think about 1968, for example. I'll try not to weep when I think of this, because I belong to that moment too. But that was it was in a way a displacement, but also, of course, an enrichment, as many displacements are, raising new questions, not least the question of sexuality, the question of media, the question of popular culture, areas that Marxism, a certain orthodox Marxism, hadn't really traditionally encompassed. And then it's always hard, I think, when one talks about culture, in the broad sense of the word, it's one of those concepts that's always hard to get into focus. It's maybe impossible to avoid either overestimating it or underestimating it. And in that, it's very like sexuality, which is very hard, if not impossible, to avoid either overestimating or underestimating. Yes? In one sense, you might say nothing could be more vital in our world than culture. I don't mean in the sense of Balzac and Beethoven. I mean culture in the sense of identity and language and tradition and community. Culture, in that sense, is what people are prepared to kill for. People are prepared to kill for culture in our world, or die for it. Yeah? But you can't, it's hard to underestimate that. On the other hand, materialists like ourselves still want to insist, in the teeth of that culture, however vital, doesn't actually go all the way down. It's not, as it were, wall to wall in the manner of postmodern thought. And that, I think, is the opening for us where a certain kind of materialism, a certain kind of realization that most people don't live by culture alone, and in the minority sense of culture, very few people live by it at all, that is the proper emphasis of what you might call cultural materialism, and it's from that point that we have to start. And what's happening in our time politically and economically actually now is allowing us to realize that much more urgently perhaps than we did 10 or so years ago.